Episode 63, April the 25th, 1915. Dauntless in the face of death. I saw the heroes of River Clyde by Major A.H. Mure, T.D. Read by Jim Cassidy. Major Mure had a spectator's view of the immortal landing of the troops from the old collier the River Clyde at V Beach from the deck of a transport close to the shore. Here he pays tribute to the almost incredible heroism of the troops who wrote this most glorious page of our military history. On April the 25th, 1915, the fleet was bombarding the Asiatic side of the Dardanelles, where the French were drawing Turkish fire by making a feint of a landing. On that side there was a long cliff with the usual row of eastern houses on the top. It was extraordinary to see a house crumple and topple down. The Russian battleship Askold, with its 5 funnels and christened by Tommy the packet of woodbines, did great execution. What looked to be a cottage was built on a small promontory jutting out from the edge of the cliff. For hours the little building defied the gunners, and seemed almost to mock the best marksmanship in Europe, so long did it stand unscathed. At last a shell landed right into it, and down it came at the first touch, exactly like a castle of playing cards, such as you and I used to build years ago. The whole ship cheered vociferously. Its end was unmistakable. When it had toppled to its doom, we turned our attention to graver matters of battle. Krithia, well to our north, was ablaze, and Achibaba, just beyond, was getting a generous share of the heavies. We could not tell how the day was going. Indescribable noise we could hear, indescribable flame and confusion we could see, indescribable carnage could infer, but we couldn't piece together or interpret the awful confusion of detail. There was a green field to the left on the top of the cliff, and we could see men rushing across it, then coming back, then advancing again as if a stiff fight were going on. Towards said Elbar there seemed to be no progress, and we, watching and waiting, began to feel nervous and imagine that all was not well. It was evident by this time that a landing had been effected, though not so successful a landing as had been anticipated. But we had begun. We were doing something. The rattle of musketry told that. It became more pronounced as the evening wore on, sharper, quicker, more distraught, as if thousands of death dice were being tossed feverishly by the nervous hands of a multitude of desperate gamblers. I don't think many slept that night, and sharp at dawn every man of us was up and astir to see, if he could, what was happening. An hour later, thralled and breathless, I was watching the first big infantry charge I had ever seen. It was a glorious and terrible sight, and I felt, as it looked, fearful and exultant. The infantry pushed and tore through the village of Sed El Bar, up to the fort, belching fire and death from the cliff beyond. The blood danced in our veins as we leaned and looked, our souls fighting with those men struggling in the thick of carnage. Their bayonets flashed in the dancing sunlight, and as the men rattled on, bleeding, dying, yet persisting, conquering, the glittering sheen they threw before them and about them scintillated like a sea of liquid, burnished steel more alive than the molten sunlight it mocked and outshone, throwing great swathes of terrible searchlight for yards in front of our straining, suffering infantry, and for yards on either side of them. And we could hear the men shouting, "Go on, lads! Go on, ye devils! Give them hell!" and cries, much more vitriolic, less episcopal. "Go on, lads!" Nothing very Homeric in that. Ah, wait and hear. Hear it from 1,000 British throats when the day runs red and the fight rises and falls in awful sheets and sweeps of torture and slaughter, necks knotted, backs strained, eyes and hearts bursting, breaths heaving and panting, wounds unheeded, death mocked and defied. The fort was taken. We saw our men stagger and sway with fatigue and the recoil of mighty work done and accomplished. Then they recovered, threw off their brief relaxation. It had been but an instant, shook themselves into position and reformed. Lieutenant Colonel Doughty Wiley of the General Staff had gone ashore to direct operations. He had to lead the assault, and leading he fell, just when the fort was as good as taken. And for a monument to a man and a soldier, the fort was given his name. In the afternoon we received a signal that ammunition was needed, and presently a pinnace came along with a lighter in tow. Then there was turmoil. Every officer itched and clamoured to go. But O.C. Troops was on board, and he went himself and took my second-in-command with him. I silently consigned them both to a place which after all was probably cool and comfortable compared with the spot where they'd landed. They both came back safely towards sunset, and we gathered about them like schoolboys round a toffee box. But they wouldn't talk. I believe they couldn't. Wilson said that it was indescribable, and that was every word I could get out of him. About 1 a.m. next morning, still more ammunition was wanted, and my chance had come. I set off in a pinnace towing 2 ammunition lighters and headed for the River Clyde, an old collier that had been turned into a sort of ferry boat for troops to carry them from troop ships to shore. Great open spaces had been cut in her side or between decks and lower down. Platforms and runs had been built that men might rush from her quickly when landing under accurate fire. Encased machine guns stood on her forecastle, that she might, when desirable, give the Turks fire for fire. She had now been beached purposely, as near shore as was practicable. From her to the shore ran a rough bridge of boats, lighters, and miscellaneous small craft, across which the men had to crawl and slide to the shore. This bridge had been built at a terrible cost, with a disregard of death as glorious as anything in the history of war. When the River Clyde was beached, 25 launches packed with men slipped ahead of her, and the men in them, knowing perfectly the nature and the extent of their danger, began to make the required bridge, getting small boats into position and securely moored, working from the River Clyde to the beach. Soon after she grounded, the Turks opened fire on the heroic little bridge of boats, finished halfway or more to the shore, bombarding it from the ruined castle of Sed el Bahr, from the higher town, and from the splendidly fortified and magnificently manned and munitioned hill that stretched across the bay. The waiting troops on the big ship were more protected, for the River Clyde was fortified too, and had many contrivances of defence. But the little boats were naked and helpless. The Turks are computed to have sent from 5,000 to 12,000 shots a minute into that devoted band of men. Not one man flinched, but most of them died. As a boatload perished, men rushed down the gangway of the River Clyde and carried on. A man who lived 10 minutes under that Turkish fire seemed to have a charmed life. Most dropped within 4 minutes. But before they dropped, they worked. Ah, and how they worked, while they yet lived. Each did his small vital bit, and when he lurched bleeding into his sea grave, a comrade newly come snatched up his job until he too died, to be succeeded by yet another British soldier. The Holocaust was hideous, but the object for which the men died was fulfilled. The bridge was completed, and the Turks couldn't prevent it. A Turkish officer, or a prisoner later, swore by Allah that it was the finest thing he ever saw, and 10 times braver than he would have credited of any man, be him Christian or Mussulman. It was over this blood-cemented bridge that Lieutenant Colonel Doughty Wiley had led his men to storm, through indescribable difficulties, the ruins of Sed el Bahr. And it was over it that I now went as cautiously as possible, leaving my pinnace beside the River Clyde, and scrambling as best I could from boat to boat. The moon had risen by this time, and the beastly evidences of the relentless conflict were thick about. You could not fail to see them clearly, and they looked all the more ghastlier in the theatrical light of the Orient moon. The heroism of the troops who built that bridge of boats in daylight, under tremendous hellish fire, must have been superlative. It beggars all words, and I will attempt none. But we thought of them, and our thoughts were eloquent, for we found it no small thing to pick our way at our own pace, the Turks temporarily inactive, over those swaying, bobbing craft. To go over them in full marching order must have been a difficult feat in itself, let alone building the way as they went, and doing it under shot and shell. On reaching the beach, I clambered over the lighter to see where the ammunition was to be dumped first, and began to slip and slide all over the place. I bent down to examine the wood on which I was skidding, and I saw, well, it wasn't water that was making me slide about. It was something thicker than water. On the shore, I found a very tired-looking assistant beachmaster. I remarked, "You seem to have had a pretty thick time." He answered not a word. He only looked at me. It was enough. I shall remember that look while I live.